Steve is walking down a street one day and he happens to see his friend, Chris. He says, "Chris, how are you?" "Terrible," says Chris. "What happened?" Steve asks. "Well, I just went bankrupt and I don't know what I'm going to do," Chris says. "Could have been worse," Steve replies. A month later Steve sees Chris in a restaurant. "How are things now?" Steve asks. "Terrible. Our house burned down last night," Chris says. "Could have been worse," Steve says again and goes about his day. 1 month later, Steve runs into Chris a third time. "Well, how are you?" he asks. "Things are getting worse. Now my wife has left me," Chris says. Steve nods his head and again says, "Could have been worse." This time, Chris grabs Steve and says, "Wait a minute. We've run into each other a few times now, and every time I've told you how badly my life is going. Now, Steve, I want you to tell me, how could it have been any worse?" Steve looks at Chris with a small smile. "Could have been worse," he says. "Could have happened to me." A man was driving on the freeway when an officer stopped him. The officer looked in the back of the man's truck and said, "Why are these penguins in your truck?" The man said, "These are my penguins. They belong to me." "You need to take them to the zoo," the cop said. The next day, the officer saw the same guy driving down the road. He pulled him over again. He saw the penguins were still in the truck, but they were wearing sunglasses this time. "I thought I told you to take these penguins to the zoo," the cop said. "I did," the man replied. "And today I'm taking them to the beach." A prince was under a curse where he could speak only one word each year. If he didn't speak for 2 years, the following year he could speak 2 words and so on. One day, he fell in love with a beautiful lady. He didn't speak for 2 years so he could call her "my darling." But then he wanted to tell her he loved her, so he waited 3 more years. At the end of these 5 years, he wanted to ask her to marry him, so he waited another 4 years. Finally, as the 9th year of silence ended, he led the lady to the most romantic place in the kingdom and said, "My darling, I love you. Will you marry me?" And the lady said, "I couldn't hear you. Can you repeat that?" A first-grade teacher was having trouble with one of her rude students, Johnny, and asked what his problem was. He said, "I'm too smart for the 1st grade. My sister is in the 3rd grade, and I'm smarter than her too." The teacher took him to the principal's office and the principal told him that he would give Johnny a test. If he got any questions wrong he would have to go back to the 1st grade and be quiet. Johnny agreed and the principal asked, "What's 3 by 3 and 6 by 6? Johnny replied, 9 and 36. It continued on like this for almost an hour. The principal asked Johnny every question a 3rd grader should know, and he answered them all correctly. Finally, the principal told the teacher, "Johnny should go to the 3rd grade since he answered all of my questions right." The teacher decided to ask him some questions herself and says, "What does a cow have 4 of, that I only have 2 of?" "Legs," Johnny replies. The teacher says, "What do you have in your pants, that I don't have?" The principal gasps, but before he can stop him from answering Johnny says, "Pockets." Then the teacher asks, "What does a dog do, that a man steps into?" Johnny replies, "Pants." Finally, the teacher asks, "What starts with F, ends with K, and means a lot of excitement?" "Fire truck," says Johnny. The principal breathes a big sigh of relief, then says, "Put Johnny in the 5th grade. I got the last 4 questions wrong myself." John visited his grandpa who lived way out in the country. On the first morning of the visit, John's grandpa prepared a breakfast of bacon and eggs. John noticed a film-like substance on his plate and asked, "Are these plates clean?" His grandpa replied, "They're as clean as water can get them, so finish your meal." For lunch, Grandpa made hamburgers. Again, John was concerned about the plates because he noticed specks of dried egg on it. "Are you sure these plates are clean?" he asked. Without looking up, Grandpa said, "I told you before, those dishes are as clean as water can get them." Later, as John was leaving, his grandpa's dog started to growl and wouldn't let him pass. John said, "Grandpa, your dog won't let me get by." Grandpa yelled to the dog, "Water, go lie down."